Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about exhausts. We're going to do it on the Widowmaker chassis since it somewhat involves it, but this is mostly a 2GR exhaust video. So let's get into it. All right, some of you guys may recognize this. These are the headers that I used to sell. I actually do not sell them anymore. This is actually the first part that I actually designed and got manufactured for the 2GR swap. Not in the Spider, obviously, in the 2nd gen MR2. And its time has come. I think the demands and the swap market and whatnot has changed, and we need to update this to make it better. Now, the reason we have the Widowmaker here is because that's one of my new requirements, right? Is it would be awfully nice if there was a bolt-in exhaust available for the MR2 Spider with the 2GR. It's just a much tighter chassis. This design here was the same header for the front and back, and especially in the front, it left a lot of space here between the collector and the engine because it left that space on the rear. Yeah, you probably can't see it right there, but the CV shaft, that stub shaft, it had to leave space for that, which meant if it was one design, it had to leave it on both sides. So that's one consideration. I want to go much tighter to the block than this. The other consideration is catalytic converters. I was always planning on putting catalytic converters on the Widowmaker, but I was going to put them further downstream. The only real effect between having them closer to the head and further downstream has to do with the startup emissions. So yeah, technically it's worse, but for most of the operating time, it's good. But why settle for that? Why not put them closer to the head? So with these new requirements, particularly the one with fitting catalytic converters and making it fit in the Spider, and actually let's make it a bit more complicated. Let's make it so that ideally it's the same part design front and rear, because that reduces the tooling costs by half, which dramatically reduces the price point at which I can bring you guys parts for. Maybe it's a little suboptimal as far as the fitment goes, but I've got some ideas. Of course, the positive side with using the same design front and rear is you're guaranteed they're going to flow the same. So that's an advantage. I mean, these motors already have enough of a bank imbalance issue. The front bank usually is running, 5-ish% off from the rear bank. It's not great, but it is what it is. They seem to do that also in the stock applications. So, using the joys of 3D printing, let's talk about the ideas. This was my first idea. So, the idea here is to go very similar to the factory manifold, right? Except we're adding a V-band here. And the reason we add a V-band is so that we can make the catalytic converter part differently for the front and the rear. Now this has a couple features to it. First, it's got runners that are different length, but it does have one advantage. If you remember when we took the 2GR head apart, the runners aren't actually normal to the head. They actually come in at about a 20-degree angle. So these runners actually match these angles. It's actually a little bit more obvious on this side here. So it goes up. Honestly, I don't know how much of a flow difference that'll make, but it certainly can't hurt to actually not have the exhaust make a 20-degree bend right away. So this is my first design. It's great. This would obviously work pretty similar to what the OEM setup works like, but this is, it just seems suboptimal. Like this is still going to take an investment cast to make. So since we're going into investment casting, why don't we use those advantages we can take? So, you'll have to excuse the terrible 3D printing here because, well, I have a love-hate relationship with 3D printing. I love it, it hates me. So ignore this. This is, yeah, either way. So I went all out. I said, well, what could we do? Well, we can even make slightly larger runners, and we can go to 2.5 inches instead of 2.25 inches, which is what we already have. And then I ended up with this giant monstrosity. Now, this giant monstrosity ended up with a few issues. First, you end up with needing a shortened stud here to be able to even get a nut on it. Otherwise, the stud actually pokes into the part. This was too much. So I went back and I looked at this thing here and thought, okay, well, what was good about this? Well, we've got 1 5/8 inch tubes here, and they're about 10.5 inch runners. I mean, they are 10.5 inch runners, but about depends on exactly where you count the merge point. But either way, 10.5 inches and 1 5/8. And these on the dyno made 304 to the ground, so that's somewhere between 350 and 360, depending on exact losses. So that's great. So what can we do to keep this, except keep in mind, this is actually, you know, there's a 20-degree bend right here in the exhaust flow. Can we fix that and keep this and meet our other requirements? So ended up right here. This is very similar to the previous one. In fact, if you don't see them side by side, it's kind of hard to see the difference. But I went back to the same runner size, the same ID as the tubular manifolds, and I went back to a 2 1/4 inch. Now, instead of a bolt-on flange like the previous design, this is a V-band, and we'll get to the why here in a second. And the runners are actually just slightly longer, so they're about 11 1/4 inches on all of them, including this one here. It just takes a slightly more circuitous route to get there and still get the runner. And if you look at the flow division in there, it's pretty nice. Now, that did mean that I had to nix the O2 sensor up here. It'll just have to go on the catalytic converter. Honestly, it's not that big of a deal. That's the way my previous design was also. So let's take a look where that gets us. If we look at the previous one, let's see if I can get it lined up with the camera. You can see the vertical, no, actually you really can't see, can you? Yeah, the vertical space this way is a tiny bit less. In the Spider, this might still take just a little bit of hammering on the firewall just to make some space. But in theory, this should clear, and the fact that the pipe is much further down, you can see, you know, that exit angle here is just overall better, because this one here was heading right into the firewall, so this one just has a better angle to it. So let's take a look at the back. So I've got the crossmember on here real quick. Let me bring you guys in. All right, so first thing to note is the crossmember's down a little bit. I've just got a lever here that I can push the crossmember up into very close to its normal position while still giving a bit more space to insert stuff here. So that's one win right there, that it can actually be installed like that, though that's really pretty inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. Now, yes, one of the sacrifices that had to be made is these will need to be installed with a box end wrench. You're not going to get a socket on most of these. That's an annoyance and something that I focused really hard on not having as an issue on my previous design, but this is, you know, you get more requirements and something has to go, so that was the one something that went. So now we can see here, here, let's put the cross member up. There's decent space there. There's like 12 millimeters. Obviously there's a concern here. It's possible that in the end we find that we might have to deform a little bit of a space there, or just cut it out just a little bit and take a small notch and just kind of weld a patch in there. But either way, this is certainly really close as it is. And it's missing this here. This is the ear that you use to lift the motor with the factory mount. Now, I don't have a power steering pump here to check, but I'm 99% sure that this will not allow power steering pump. But that's fine, because every application that I intend on these being used in uses no power steering or electric power steering. And if you're swapping this into a different application and you want to use my parts, well, you're just going to have to also convert the car to either electric over hydraulic or just pure electric power steering. That's a pretty minor thing in the grand scheme. So this part, of course, can then fit the V-band. And then, of course, we've still got a catalytic converter here. Now, this here is, it's a cutoff from the OEM catalytic converter. You can't generally buy these unless your motor came with them, but I'm using them as a good example because this diameter here and this length is obviously the right length that this motor needs. So whatever we end up with. And MagnaFlow has one that's very, very similar in size. It doesn't have this shield here, which will actually save a bit of space, but check this out. So that allows that to be, I mean, it'll probably be a little bit higher in the end there. It allows that to be nestled in there, nice and tight. Now keep in mind, in the second gen, this has to connect to the pipe that's actually going underneath the cross member here. But by having it folded on top of itself, it gives this one more length. So it's actually going to have to then go back here and merge into the pipe. That's good, because that actually makes this bank have a longer run, which makes up for the fact that the other bank is starting clear at the front of the motor, and it already has a long run to get back here, giving them a pretty similar to equal length. The other thing to keep in mind is this transmission here, the EB actually places the axle shaft a little bit higher. So on the E-Series and the second gen, there's actually going to be even more clearance down to the axle. Now, is that going to leave enough clearance for the S54's inner joint? That might be a solid no. That doesn't mean you can't use the S54. It just means that we might need to come up with an intermediate shaft solution for the S54. Now that Ty over at TCS Motorsports makes those second gen swap axles with the NA splines on the outside, it might be worth visiting that thought. Either way, one thing at a time here. Now for something that I haven't done before turning this camera on, let's try this on the other side. Right now there's the other version of this on the front of it, the one for the different end of the car. So that's taking up all that space. I can't even sneak that up in there to test. So let's take the motor and drop it out, at least partially. I'm not sure how far we're going to need to go to be able to put that on and then put it back in. So as you saw, I had to pull the oil cooler off. We'll get to that discussion in a second. But if we go here, you know, this shield's kind of in the way here, but you can see that's not going to be tight enough for the MR2 Spider, because the firewall is, well, the cross member here is going to touch this for sure. But this is definitely going to be close enough for the SW20. And unfortunately, that does mean, oh, this thing just keeps pouring oil. No matter, give me a sec. All right, so seriously, I just had it over there. I turned it in every single direction and there was no more coming out. And all right, whatever. So now, thankfully, the oil cooler does still fit. And if you have a tight pipe here, like if you're actually using this in a racing application, which is really the only reason you need this oil cooler, Toyota puts this on here for their heavy towing applications. Now, these coolant lines, you're probably going to actually want to make some hard coolant lines, because the other ones, they do fit, but they're getting awfully close to this manifold. So some hard lines with some little couplers there, and you could still use this for race applications, but I think I'm going to have to make a decision where the OEM oil cooler and the catalytic converter style exhaust just simply cannot coexist. Of course, depending on your locale, well, yeah, that's a good point. Depending on your locale, you can put the catalytic converter right down here. Your cold start emissions are going to be a little bit worse, but not significantly. And once it's up to temperature, it's not going to make any difference at all. So the big difference that it makes, though, obviously I can make a part that's more appropriate for here. The big difference that this makes is cost. The tens of thousands of dollars worth of tooling to get this part made, only having to pay for that once, means I can keep the price cost per part significantly lower. So I think, as much as I hate to nix the stock oil cooler option, I think that's just going to have to be the way it is. Well, before we commit to this, we have to make sure that it actually does fit in the Spider. And just a heads up, I'm okay if this touches the firewall at places where it's easy to just kind of hammer some extra clearance in, or add a panel here. It just has to not be competing for space significantly. So let's go ahead and put that in like that and see what it looks like. All right, let me take the GoPro under there and see if I can show you guys what it looks like. So this is what we have. You can see it is just barely touching the firewall. This, this chassis is really not made to fit a V6 engine. But overall, it's looking pretty good. Even in this area here with the fuel line and the shift cables, obviously the heat shield will have to be made. It'll have to be a pretty good heat shield, maybe 2 layers. But overall, this is doable. I think, yeah, I think so. All right, so that actually fit pretty good. Keep in mind, the main purpose of that exhaust is actually not the spider. The main purpose is to be able to add catalytic converters to the second gen. So I'm going to go ahead and consider this a success. I'm not thrilled about the fact that we're losing the oil cooler, but it is what it is. Honestly, this motor doesn't need an oil cooler for most things that we're doing with it anyways. Unless you're doing endurance racing, it's just not necessary. So, yeah. Yeah, I think that's all I've got. So I'm going to work on getting pricing and everything for that. I know there's a bunch of you guys that are going to ask how much they're going to cost. I have no idea yet. So I'm going to work on that from the manufacturing side of things, and I'll get back to you guys when I've got some news on that. Have a good one. We'll talk to you guys later. Bye.